In the summer of 1974, a senior American diplomat flew to Riyadh with a proposition that would quietly shape the next 50 years of global history. The diplomat was William Simon, then U.S. Treasury Secretary. The proposition was straightforward. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars and invest its surplus revenues in U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange, the United States would guarantee the security of the House of Saud, military protection, weapons, intelligence, diplomatic cover against any threat, foreign or domestic. The deal was struck. The petrodollar system was born, and for half a century it held. Saudi Arabia got security, America got dollar dominance. The world got a stable, if sometimes brutally enforced, energy order built on a single currency and a single security guarantee. That deal is now coming apart. Not dramatically, not with a formal announcement or a public rupture, but structurally, quietly, and with a deliberateness that should alarm every analyst of American power. Saudi Arabia is walking away from the arrangement that has defined its relationship with the United States for 50 years. I'm Richard Hale, and in this video, I am going to show you exactly how the Saudi-American relationship was built, what has driven its progressive deterioration over the past decade, what the Iran war of 2026 has done to accelerate a fracture that was already well underway, and what Saudi Arabia's strategic pivot toward China means for the petrodollar system, for American power in the Middle East, and for the global order that both were built to sustain. If you have been watching this channel, you already know that the dollar's structural decline and the Strait of Hormuz crisis are two expressions of the same underlying shift in the global balance of power. Saudi Arabia is where both of those stories converge. It is the pivot point of the New World Order. And understanding what is happening in Riyadh right now is essential to understanding where the world is going. If you are new to this channel, subscribe and turn on notifications now. This is precisely the kind of analysis you will find here every time. Let me start with what the relationship was actually built on, because most Americans understand the Saudi-US alliance in terms of oil and security, which is correct as far as it goes. But the deeper architecture of the relationship is more specific and more consequential than that simplified framing suggests. The 1974 petrodollar agreement was not simply a trade deal. It was a grand strategic bargain that simultaneously solved four distinct problems for the two parties involved. For the United States, it solved the problem created by Nixon's 1971 decision to end dollar-gold convertibility. Without gold backing, the dollar needed a new anchor, a new reason for every country in the world to hold dollars as their reserve currency. Oil provided that anchor. If every barrel of oil sold anywhere in the world had to be purchased in dollars, then every country needed dollars to run its economy, and the structural demand for the dollar was guaranteed by the energy requirements of the entire global industrial system. For Saudi Arabia, it solved the problem of a ruling family sitting on top of the world's largest oil reserves in a region of extraordinary instability, surrounded by rivals who coveted what it had. The American security guarantee, backed by the most powerful military in human history, was the ultimate insurance policy for the House of Saud. But the deal also had two less discussed dimensions that are critical to understanding why it is now failing. The first was discretion. The petrodollar arrangement was not a public treaty. It was a confidential understanding. Saudi Arabia was not seen to be formally subordinating its monetary sovereignty to Washington. The architecture was deliberately opaque, which meant that as long as both sides honored it, it could be maintained without the political cost of visible dependency. The second was exclusivity. The American security guarantee was extended to Saudi Arabia on the implicit understanding that the kingdom would not develop competing security relationships with American adversaries. The deal was not just oil for dollars, it was oil for dollars in exchange for strategic alignment with the American-led order. Both of these dimensions, the discretion and the exclusivity, are now broken. And understanding how they broke explains everything about where we are today. The first major fracture came not from Saudi Arabia, but from Washington, and it came in a form that Riyadh found deeply alarming: the Arab Spring. In 2011, when popular uprisings swept through Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, and Yemen, the Obama administration's response sent a message to the Gulf monarchies that they have never forgotten. When Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, a decades-long American ally, was swept from power, Washington did not defend him. When protests erupted in Bahrain, home of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the Obama administration publicly called for political reform rather than unambiguously backing the ruling Al Khalifa family. From the perspective of Riyadh, this was a revelation of the First Order. The American security guarantee, it turned out, had conditions. It extended to external military threats. It did not necessarily extend to internal political threats. And in a region where the primary existential risk to Gulf monarchies was domestic instability rather than foreign invasion, this was a distinction that mattered enormously. The message that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman drew from the Arab Spring and from American behavior during it was precise and unambiguous. The United States could not be relied upon to defend the House of Saud if the threat came from within. The 1974 bargain had an unexamined gap, and that gap ran directly through the most dangerous terrain for Gulf Arab monarchies. The second fracture came from the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, signed in 2015 under the Obama administration. Saudi Arabia's relationship with Iran is not simply geopolitical rivalry. It is an existential competition, religious, ethnic, demographic, and strategic, that has defined Middle Eastern power politics for decades. The Sunni-Shia divide, the Arab-Persian divide, the competition for regional dominance, all of it is embodied in the Saudi-Iran relationship. When the Obama administration negotiated the JCPOA with Iran, releasing billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets and providing sanctions relief in exchange for temporary constraints on Iran's nuclear program, Saudi Arabia experienced it as a strategic betrayal. Washington had chosen engagement with Riyadh's most dangerous adversary over the reassurance of its most important Gulf ally. The Saudis were not consulted meaningfully. They were presented with a fait accompli. The billions released to Iran funded precisely what Saudi Arabia had most feared: an expansion of Iranian proxy activity across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, who began their most aggressive campaign against Saudi territory in the period following the JCPOA. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. The security environment for Saudi Arabia deteriorated measurably in the years following the deal that Washington told Riyadh was designed to improve regional stability. The third fracture, and the one that most directly challenged the exclusivity dimension of the original bargain, was the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in October 2018. Khashoggi's killing inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, carried out, according to CIA assessment, on the direct orders of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, produced a response from Washington that revealed something important about the changing nature of American domestic politics and their intersection with foreign policy. The Biden administration, upon taking office, declassified the CIA assessment implicating MBS directly. It imposed sanctions on individuals involved in the killing. It publicly reframed the relationship with Saudi Arabia, announcing that America would no longer provide support for offensive Saudi operations in Yemen and publicly distancing itself from the Crown Prince personally. For Mohammed bin Salman, this was not simply a decree, the diplomatic rebuke. It was a demonstration that the American political system, Congress, the media, the activist community, the incoming Democratic administration, was capable of weaponizing Saudi Arabia's domestic governance against the kingdom in ways that the 1974 arrangement had never contemplated. The discretion that had made the petrodollar deal workable for 50 years was gone. The relationship had become a domestic American political football, and MBS drew the logical conclusion that a relationship that could be so easily weaponized by American internal politics was a relationship whose terms needed to be fundamentally renegotiated. This is the context in which Mohammed bin Salman began systematically and deliberately to build Saudi Arabia's strategic alternatives. The most visible expression of this was the China relationship. Let me show you exactly how far that relationship has developed, because the depth of the China-Saudi strategic partnership is not adequately understood in most Western analysis. In March 2023, China brokered the normalization of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two most bitter rivals in the Middle East, in a deal that excluded the United States entirely. Washington was not a party to the negotiations. It was not consulted in advance. It learned of the agreement when it was announced. The country that brokered the most significant diplomatic development in the Middle East in a generation was China. The country that had positioned itself as the indispensable security guarantor of the Gulf for 50 years played no role. The symbolism was so deliberate and so precise that it could not have been accidental. Mohammed bin Salman was demonstrating to Washington, to Beijing, and to every government in the world that Saudi Arabia now had a credible alternative diplomatic patron, and that it was willing to use that patron for initiatives of the highest strategic significance. The economic dimensions of the China-Saudi relationship have developed with equal deliberateness. Saudi Arabia joined the BRICS grouping in January 2024, the first Gulf Arab state to do so. BRICS is the institutional vehicle for the de-dollarization movement I described in the first video on this channel. Saudi Arabia's membership in it is not simply a diplomatic gesture. It is a structural alignment with the alternative financial architecture that China has been building for years, an architecture specifically designed to reduce dependence on the dollar system that Saudi Arabia helped create in 1974. In 2023, Saudi Arabia publicly confirmed that it was open to settling oil trades in currencies other than the dollar, including the Chinese yuan. This was not a minor technical adjustment. It was a direct challenge to the foundational premise of the petrodollar arrangement. The 1974 deal was specifically about pricing oil in dollars. Any movement toward yuan-denominated oil settlement is a movement toward the unwinding of that deal. Saudi Arabia has been conducting military cooperation with China, joint exercises, weapons purchases, technology transfers, that would have been entirely incompatible with the exclusivity dimension of the original American security guarantee. The kingdom purchased Chinese ballistic missiles. It is in discussion about Chinese assistance with its civilian nuclear program. It has integrated Chinese technology, including Huawei infrastructure, into its telecommunications networks, despite American pressure to exclude it. None of this happened overnight. All of it happened gradually, deliberately, and with full awareness of what it meant for the Saudi-American relationship. If you are finding this analysis useful, and what the Iran war has done to accelerate all of this is the part that most coverage is completely missing, hit that like button and subscribe if you have not already. Now let me show you what Operation Epic Fury has done to a relationship that was already severely strained. The strikes of February 28, 2026 were conducted by the United States and Israel against Iranian territory. They were the most significant military operation in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And they were conducted without the explicit endorsement of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or any of the Gulf Arab states whose territory, airspace, and energy infrastructure are most directly exposed to Iranian retaliation. The Gulf Arab states were not uninformed. Intelligence sharing and diplomatic consultations occurred, but being consulted is not the same as being a partner. And what the Gulf Arabs heard in those consultations, that the objective was regime change in Iran, that the operation aimed to eliminate the supreme leader, and that the United States was confident of a rapid and decisive outcome, has been comprehensively contradicted by subsequent events. Khamenei was killed. The regime did not collapse. The Revolutionary Guard remained operational. And Iran's response, closing the Strait of Hormuz, has inflicted devastating economic damage on the Gulf Arab states themselves. Saudi Arabia's oil, the UAE's trade, Kuwait's revenues, all of it blocked or severely disrupted by Iranian action that was triggered by American and Israeli strikes that the Gulf Arabs did not endorse and cannot control. The fury in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi is real and it is deep. The Gulf Arab states are experiencing the worst of all possible worlds: the disruption of their primary revenue source as a direct consequence of military action by their supposed security guarantor, conducted without their full partnership, producing outcomes that no one planned for and no one currently has a clear strategy to resolve. Mohammed bin Salman has said, in private conversations that have been extensively reported, that the American security guarantee is worth less than it appeared. That a guarantor who can trigger a regional war that devastates your economy while pursuing objectives you did not fully endorse and achieving outcomes that harm you directly is not the guarantor the 1974 bargain imagined. This is not a break. Not yet. Saudi Arabia still needs American military technology, American intelligence, American diplomatic protection at the United Nations. The relationship has too many load-bearing dimensions to be abandoned quickly, but it is a fundamental reassessment, and the direction of that reassessment is unmistakable. Saudi Arabia is moving deliberately, strategically, and with a clarity of long-term purpose that Riyadh rarely displays publicly, toward a position of genuine non-alignment. Not anti-American, not pro-Chinese, but genuinely independent, able to balance between the two great powers in ways that maximize Saudi leverage and minimize Saudi vulnerability to the decisions of either. The model MBS appears to be studying is not the Saudi Arabia of 1974. It is the India of 2024. A country that maintains deep relationships with both the United States and Russia, that buys Russian oil at discount prices while also buying American weapons, that participates in American-led security frameworks while also engaging with BRICS, and that has used its strategic ambiguity to achieve a level of global influence disproportionate to its conventional power. Saudi Arabia has the resources to pursue that model more aggressively than India. The kingdom's sovereign wealth fund, the Public Investment Fund, holds over $700 billion in assets and is projected to reach $2 trillion by 2030. Its oil revenues, even at reduced levels during the current Strait crisis, provide a financial cushion that most countries attempting strategic pivots do not have. Now let me give you the consequences of this pivot, for the dollar, for American power, and for the global order. The petrodollar system's continued functioning depends on Saudi Arabia's continued willingness to price its oil in dollars and recycle its surpluses through U.S. Treasury markets. If Saudi Arabia moves, even partially, even incrementally, toward yuan-denominated oil settlement, it breaks the self-reinforcing cycle that has sustained dollar dominance since 1974. It does not break it immediately. It does not break it catastrophically. Why in the short term? But it breaks the structural logic. Other Gulf producers, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, will follow Saudi Arabia's lead on currency settlement as they have followed it on OPEC production decisions for decades. The marginal demand for dollar reserves falls. The captive market for U.S. Treasury bonds narrows. The exorbitant privilege that the dollar has enjoyed for 80 years begins to erode from the energy foundation that has sustained it since 1974. This is why the dollar video and the straight video and this video are not three separate stories. They are one story. The story of the architecture of American global power, built in 1944 at Bretton Woods and reinforced in 1974 in Riyadh, now being challenged simultaneously at every structural foundation by the accumulated consequences of American foreign policy decisions that were made without adequate attention to their long-term strategic costs. The security guarantee failed the Gulf Arabs during the Arab Spring. The Iran nuclear deal prioritized engagement with their adversary over their reassurance. The Khashoggi response weaponized the relationship domestically. And Operation Epic Fury triggered a regional war that devastated their economies without achieving its stated objectives. Each of these was a withdrawal from the deposit account of trust and reliability that the 1974 arrangement required to function, and the account is now overdrawn. Let me close with the question that matters most for the people watching this video. Does Saudi Arabia's strategic pivot matter to ordinary Americans, to Canadians, to people who have no particular interest in Middle Eastern geopolitics and simply want to understand the world they are living in? The answer is yes, profoundly and practically. If Saudi Arabia prices its oil in yuan, even partially, even for a portion of its Chinese sales, it reduces the structural demand for dollars in the global energy market. That reduction in dollar demand, compounded over years and joined by other producers following Saudi Arabia's lead, is one of the primary mechanisms by which the erosion of American purchasing power and the rise of American borrowing costs will eventually be felt by every American family. If Saudi Arabia moves toward genuine non-alignment, developing its Chinese relationship to the point where Washington cannot assume Gulf Arab cooperation on sanctions, on military basing, on diplomatic coordination, American foreign policy in the Middle East and beyond becomes structurally more constrained and more expensive. And if the 1974 petrodollar deal, the arrangement that replaced gold as the dollar's anchor and sustained American financial dominance for half a century, is progressively unwound by the country that built it alongside the United States, then the most consequential restructuring of the global monetary order since Bretton Woods will have been set in motion. Not by an enemy, not by China or Russia or an ideological rival, by an ally, by a country whose sovereign wealth fund holds hundreds of billions of dollars in American assets, by a country whose ruling family has visited Washington more times than most American senators. That is the measure of how profoundly the strategic landscape has shifted. William Simon flew to Riyadh in 1974 with a proposition that held the world together for 50 years. Nobody in Washington today appears to be flying to Riyadh with a proposition that can hold it together for 50 more. If this analysis changed the way you see the Saudi story, share it with someone who still thinks of Saudi Arabia as simply an American ally. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next piece of this picture. And tell me in the comments, do you think the United States can recover the Saudi relationship? And if so, what would that recovery actually require? I'm Richard Hale, and I will see you in the next analysis.